right, here we go. Did we get to tenant farming?
Yes.
So we got the tenant farming, we got the crop lean.
We ended off on populist way.
Oh, we got populist way. We're way up there. Good. So we got tenant farm. Oh, so sharecropping and tenant farming. What was it? What's the term for if you put up your crop as collateral, or you borrow a car, you put your car up for collateral? What is that word?
It's a lien.
Lien. Yeah, you sign that document. It's kind of a scary thing when you sign a lien. And basically, the sharecroppers became basically what?
Slaves.
Yeah, slaves or serfs. Yeah, same basic idea. And bound to the land by debt. Always an issue with farmers, but debt. And, oh, who was elected president in 1876? Yeah, Rutherford B. Hayes. And what political party was Hayes? Republican. And what did the Republicans agree to do to get Hayes president? Yeah, they abandoned Reconstruction. Now, it's going to take about 15 years to fully establish total Redeemer government, but it's beginning right there. And it was becoming a political problem for Republicans. They were being tied to civil rights, and they wanted things like higher tariffs and protection for monopolies and having the gold standard. So, where are we at here? We got this. We get this.
You have a
You just
question?
have it right now.
All right. That's it. The populist way. And the populist way was this grassroots, that means populace or people. People misuse populace all the time now, it irritates me. But it's really from the people, not from leaders ordering down. It's from a wave of people, policies to protect working people, small farmers, etc. And it really was an attempt at a multiracial democracy. Something that Reconstruction started, and this was the last gasp until the 1960s, really, until it happened. And they called these groups of populists fusion parties. Fusion. So, for example, they did really well in North Carolina at first, were spreading throughout the South. And they were populists, which were kind of a descendant of Democrats. In fact, populists, the best example of a descendant of populists would be Franklin Roosevelt. But descendants of these kind of working class, he wasn't, but he represented them, and also Republicans, which in the South were mostly black voters by then. And so it was a mix of them. North Carolina, but it was everywhere. And the ruling class absolutely went nuts because of this. It did everything to just stop them, but they did really well in North Carolina. And they immediately claimed, once again, it's like Reconstruction and black misrule. And so here's a couple. These are from newspapers in North Carolina, mostly representing Democratic planter class voters. And so don't be tempted by the devil. And it's fusionists. See the devil, fusionists, telling them to vote. And here, the meeting of a white man in Wilmington. Why Wilmington? That was that was the town of the leading fusionist party. And a full attendance desired as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. They did not hide what they were talking about. And they really pushed this idea of misrule and corruption and the devil. So this cartoon is from North Carolina also. It's one of the more famous against the fusion party. See, it says fusion ballot box. Look at the horrible racial caricature and Negro misrule. And it's really a race to divide people. Divide working class people, implying or using races to divide, much like this idea goes all the way back to Bacon's rebellion in 1676. This kind of thinking comes back time after time. I see this used in a lot of different places because it's a pretty shocking picture. And you notice their talons, their claws about ready to get obviously white people. But it's about Wilmington, but these fusionist parties. So in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was an outright insurrection. White voters called red shirts, a white militia, even though technically they couldn't call themselves militia anymore, they had a bloody coup. They attacked and murdered a number of fusionist government leaders, some black, some white, And these mobs, all the mobs were white, attacked. And it really depended on your point of view on this. Here is a newspaper in New York City, and it was the New York Herald, and a lot of their audience was, because it's a big city, now explain why big cities, with a black readership, whites killed Negroes and seized control of Wilmington. They just overturned the government and put in a different government, a democratic government, Democratic Party. And even though the Fusionists were Democrats too, life is complex. Here's a different newspaper, the blacks to blame. There is no doubt that the Negroes are responsible for the precipitating of the race war, as the following affidavit from the thoroughly reputable citizens will attest, Wilmington, North Carolina. And this would establish, basically the Fusion Party would be crushed in North Carolina, and this ended Fusionist parties. There'd be another wave of attacks on Fusionists in Georgia, and that would be, and in fact, they literally called it the final redemption of white rule. And once this happened, the last gasp for a multiracial democracy. So basically saying people of all colored skin, that is where you start getting the full establishment of segregation in the South. What do we call segregation of the South? What's that word? Based on a minstrel show. Do you know what segregation of the South is? Jim Crow. Did somebody say that? Good, I didn't hear it. Jim Crow law. If you did not know that, now you have to know that. Jim Crow. And why that minstrel show? That's never been fully clear. And it's a two-part thing. The first part is segregation. So separating white from black. And it's more than just simply saying, well, white people didn't want black people in their stores, and they didn't want them in their restaurants. No. What segregation meant is that a significant percentage of the society could not participate in the commercial aspects of society, in trade, in business, in commerce. They did not have that opportunity to either start their own business, to produce goods, to provide a service, to work in jobs where they can do that. It said that a significant number of people, economically, this is economic segregation, economically are second class. It's more than just somebody saying, I don't want to serve somebody because I don't like the way they look or whatever. It's not a matter of simple private property. It is telling a certain group of people they cannot participate. And remember, the federal government is the one who prints the money, decides its value, distributes it. And so now the federal government is basically saying, we're going to allow this to happen. This is a blatant violation of what amendment says everybody will be guaranteed due process of the law, the 14th Amendment. It is a direct violation of this. So I repeat, it's more than just somebody saying, I don't want somebody on my private property. It's saying they can't participate in the normal economic activities of that state or that city. So it's economic, a permanent underclass. Oh, by the way, if there's a permanent underclass, what does that do to wages for everybody else? Is it on your watch record? What does it do to their wages? It drives everybody's wages down. Who benefits? Yeah, those on the very top. So there's a reason for this. Next, debt restrictions. It made state law those worker contracts that said workers are bound to the land. It said they can't leave their land until their sharecroppers farm now by 1890 until they pay back their debt. And since they'll never pay back their debt, not only are they bound to the land, but they will be arrested and tried by the state. And therefore, these states that have this, by definition, because to control people like this, you need a police state. And so they dramatically increased the size of local police and state police. Police forces were still relatively new, usually as a method to control people. And they're still new. Remember, the first municipal police force that was full-time was created in New York City in the 1820s to stop Christmas. But now It is to control a population. So here's a couple things. This is actually the sheet music of Jim Crow, from the songs from Jim Crow, the minstrel show. Here is a caricature of Jim Crow in 1900, horrifically racist. Here is an example of just simple little thing. A new Coke machine. Coca-Cola started in Atlanta, and whites only. Movie theater, colored admission, only on top. And to give you an idea of the extent of Jim Crow, after 1913, the United States government would be segregated. And here, World War II, showers for officers. And this is in Fort Bragg, which is just so weird. White officers and colored officers. It's no longer called Fort Bragg. But that's so weird because Bragg was a Confederate general. And they have Union forts named after Confederate generals. And a really crazy one, who was an idiot. I'm telling you how dumb he was. But police state, think about it. You violate these laws, now you're a police, or now you're arrested, and what can you do to arrest these? The convict lease system. The 13th Amendment allowed people to be arrested for violating all those laws or just made up laws for vagrancy. We talked about this when I talked about the 13th Amendment, but now they're going to come into place. Here is a chain gang in Alabama. Gee, I wonder if there's anything you can kind of pick out about the chain gang. But these are people that are going to be arrested and then sold. They're not working for the prison. They are leased at incredibly low salaries, low rates as slaves to railroads, or for this matter, the city of Birmingham, Alabama. And that lowers everybody's wages. White, black, no matter what. Male, female, doesn't matter. It lowers wages. And yes, they had quotas, and yes, they would round people up. And yes, there are still chain gangs who do the same thing, working on the highways, that kind of thing. Has anyone ever seen one? I've seen one, and it was very disturbing. These are prisoners out there. Yeah, it was very disturbing to me, at least. Well, another part, it's not necessarily directly related. It's not like part of Jim Crow, but it allows for Jim Crow to go on as voter suppression. So they want to destroy the Republican vote. Now, this is the Republican vote in the South, and that basically means, to the point of view of the powers that be, the poor vote, the vote of the poor. And I gotta remind you, I keep saying, this is the Democratic Party in the South. Things are going to change. It's more complex than the political parties even today. And the basic ways, the most common way, of course, is just terror. Threaten people. This cartoon shows an example of, obviously over the top example, but just threaten people. Sure you want to vote? And I'll give you an example of this terror in action with a pretty terrifying picture. But also, it's going to be called the Mississippi Plan. And these, when I say legal, these are voted on by the state assembly as legal methods to keep people from voting. Legal methods. And there are ways to do this where you don't violate the law. The first one is we have to suppress voter fraud. There's voter fraud. So this was a big call that the Republicans were allowing for voter fraud in the 1870s and 1880s. So we have to have stricter measures to keep people from illegally voting. Now, sure, there was some fraud. But what you really do is you just have strict measures to keep certain people from voting. And people cry voter fraud all the way to this day. And since I understand the history, understand is maybe not the right word. I know the history. I'm always learning more about it, trying to understand more. But I never trust anybody who says voter fraud today. I don't trust them because I know the past. And you should be skeptical. Be skeptical of that. Next, a poll tax. This poll tax was old, and this is a way to keep poor people from voting. And so here's a cartoon from 1940 talking about the poll tax. It wasn't a huge tax, but it was done in such a way that it was a pain. It was difficult to do. So, for example, you'd have to pay the poll tax in January, and then you vote in November. So they made it difficult. And if you don't have much money, even a small tax is a big tax to you. So this bars people from voting. So here's a cartoon against it from 1940. It is technically unconstitutional, even though there are ways around it. You say it's not a poll tax, but you make people get paid for certain types of ID. It's a way around so you can still have a poll tax. Anybody know who the cartoon is? Who say the poll tax keeps people from voting? Anyone recognize who this cartoon is? It's Dr. Seuss. Yeah, Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist. He was very much a New Dealer. He was a pro-Roosevelt New Dealer and anti-fascist. And then after the war, he started doing his children's books, which are great. So, but the most famous way would be the grandfather's clause. And basically the grandfather clause said is, you have to take a literacy test if your grandfather didn't vote. It applies to everybody, so it fits under the 14th Amendment. It applies to everybody. I'll explain the 90 and 30 in just a second. Everybody. But whose grandfathers couldn't vote? Slaves or immigrants. So it's an either or, but mostly slaves. Now the literacy test is basically your knowledge of government. And the test was written in such a way that who could pass it? Nobody, including the people giving the test. So next year in AP Government, I know Mr. Zarnowski did it last year, and my guess is he'll do it again this year. I know the previous AP Government teachers did it. And I'll show you an example of this. I think he has the Alabama or Georgia literacy test from the 1950s. And if you take AP Government, you'll take it and you will not pass. I'm just telling you right now. And you're all smart and you know government. You probably know a lot. And as this year goes by, you'll learn a lot here. And you obviously learn more in government, but you won't pass it. It's really hard. For example, you have to name all the cabinet members. That's 18. I know a good hunk of them, but I don't know the names of all off the top of my head. Just a blank line. Oh, you won't pass. I remember a few years ago, there was like one, when this teacher, Mr. Cooney, used to teach it, and I think he had two actually passed. That was the most. That's the first time anybody passed. I know last year nobody passed. Maybe you're not smart. It's designed not to pass. I passed it, but that, I know this stuff, and just barely, And I was like, God, this is hard. I did not get the cabinets. I got a bunch of them, but it was written in such a way it's really difficult. And what's going to happen to voting? By the turn of the century, over 90%, that's 90 plus, of blacks in the South and 30% of whites could not vote. Combination of poll tax, terror, or just simply made clear, you vote, you're going to be roughed up. Secret ballots didn't exist till the 20th century. So they would stand right there and watch you vote too. So that kind of intimidation was really scary. Someone had their hand up. Yeah. Yeah, could apply to everybody. Poll taxes are now unconstitutional, and that comes from 1963. But now eventually the Supreme Court in 1919 would throw out part of these laws, but they still allow for a literacy test for everybody. But by then the damage was done. If you ever heard someone is grandfathered in now, it just means that if you were legal before the law changed, you're grandfathered in. And it comes from these grandfather's clause. And so if they change the law for something, and, for example, and this happened. They used to give driver's licenses to 14-year-olds. And 14-year-olds, this is 40 years ago. If you were, and they moved it to 15. I think now, is it? It's still 15.
It's 14 and a half if you do driver's ed.
If you do driver's ed, yeah. And so if you had your driver's license, if it's still 14 when they moved it up to 15, you kept your driver's license. Your grandfather did. I can remember when the United States in '83 decided they wanted every state to move their drinking age up to 21. Montana was 19. And so they basically said, we're going to withhold highway funds unless you raise your drinking age. Everyone raised their drinking age. But if you were old, like over 19, when the drinking age changed, you were grandfathered back up. So that's what I mean when someone says grandfather. So all these court cases, or all Jim Crow and the voting rights, would wind their way through the court system. And eventually, the landmark decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the most controversial court cases in history, not quite Dred Scott, but right there. Homer Plessy, he was actually recruited. He was a civil rights leader from Louisiana, actually recruited for a leader, also working man, had to work, but by the Southern Pacific Railroad, who didn't want to pay for separate cars. And so he sat on the white car on the Southern Pacific Railroad. So it's about segregated railroads. And the Southern Pacific just wanted to pay for one car, especially when they left the South and went to California, which was did not have Jim Crow. And so it was a 14th Amendment. Did it deprive people of equal dual protection under the law by having separate facilities? And remember, the reason they're separate is to put one color skin over the other. It didn't happen like this, implying it's kind of a pretty prejudiced caricature attacking him, but it was just basically it's all set up, boom, he sat down, boom, he's arrested. So the court case was set up. The Supreme Court ruled, so by then they had established 9 justices, 7-2, that it was constitutional. If you have separate but equal facilities, it's constitutional. So if you have separate schools, as long as they're equal. Now, there's no definition of equal. I think you understand what that's going to mean. But that's, if you ever heard the term separate but equal. Now, on its very face, this is unconstitutional because it has no longer equal due process under the law. That's not equal protection at all. I should add that there were a few cases that chipped away at Plessy versus Ferguson. 2 things. It has never been fully overturned by the Supreme Court to this day. Never fully overturned. So there have been cases on certain elements of it. Most famously, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1954 overturned separate but equal in public schools, but not no place else. No place else. 4 years earlier, there was an overturning graduate schools, for example. So it's never been fully overturned. So that is still a little bit of a legacy. It is they basically just decided we're going to read the 14th Amendment the way we want to read it, and we don't care. So out of this, the beginnings of the Solid South. The Solid South would vote democratically all the way until 1964, for the most part. And the South was also very insular. Anybody know what insular means? Yeah, like an island, exactly. It really didn't get a lot of immigrants. It didn't get a lot of people moving in. You won't see a large number of people moving south until the 1950s. Why? Air conditioning. It's more than that, but that was really the big thing. You know, Florida was a place for people from New York City with a little bit of money to go down in the winter to escape the weather, and then all of a sudden air conditioning. Oh, that changes everything. There's a reason why all of a sudden people started moving here. Now, back to this. So, every election, they voted Democratic. And so you're going to have really 2 different Democratic parties. A very conservative, segregationist Democratic Party in the South, and more a populist working people's party in the North. At least to the 1960s, and then things began to blow up on the war and everything else. That's what you really see in like the New Deal was a northern urban election. 1964, what was the issue that broke up the Solid South for the Democrats? A Democratic initiative, a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress pushed through the Civil Rights Act. And Southern Many Southern Democrats started to become what? Republicans. Took about 20 years. But by 1972, the South was mostly Republican. Now, the Republican Party is a Southern party. It took a while, but that's when it started. And so here it's a liberal president, liberal as in pro-civil rights, pro-New Deal. We'll explain more of that down the road. John Kennedy, when he's running for president in 1960, he's a Northerner. So he's got to get Southern Democratic votes. So here he is, and that's the brand new at the time flag for Mississippi. You might notice the Confederate battle flag. Anti-civil rights. That's why they put the Confederate battle flag on. And he's got to go there. Kennedy is for civil rights. But he's got to get those votes. And yeah, Lyndon Johnson would say after he signed the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party has lost the South for 3 generations. He'd be wrong. It was longer. And so, this is going to be the most racist time, the nadir, the height of racism, not just in the United States, but in world history. This is going to become a dominance of a certain philosophy some of you might have heard of, and we'll talk about very soon, called social Darwinism. And European powers will begin to conquer all of Africa. 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and much of Asia would be in this era the most racist time in history, the most prejudiced, and not just against people of African descent, but also against Asians, especially against Jews in this era. And I personify by this by showing you lynchings. The torturing to death we usually associate with hanging of, wow, I love how they put justice on here, a vigilante hanging. It's a big affair. No one's ever going to be arrested. In the South, this is in Texas. That's in Birmingham, Alabama. And I like the fact that they came in their Sunday best. And there were lynchings all over the South. This is kept by the NAACP, which we'll get to, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We will talk about them down the road, so it's coming. But these are the known lynchings. And it's probably higher, but they didn't want to be accused of making up numbers. So they kept a lower figure in these 30 years, or 20 years, 30 years, I'm sorry. But, you know, for example, there were lynchings in Utah, but no one ever said anything, so that's why there's not a lot, but there were. Montana is mostly American Indians, but it's others too. And you'll see where most of the lynchings are going to be. And this is to intimidate and terrorize people who might vote, etc. And this would be a cartoon during that era. In self-defense, Southern chivalry. If I hadn't killed you, you would have grown up to rule me. A little bit too much on the head. And so here are 2 more. That is someone who voted. That's in Atlanta. That is even more terrifying. Here is a lynching, and they're posing with the body that they burned after he was hung. This is some method of torturing to death. But you'll notice this is on the back. This was turned into a postcard. And they would sell these as postcards and mementos. To give you the idea how just casual this was at this time. Nobody would ever be arrested for these. And if there was even a hint of a trial, they would be acquitted. Now, there would be attempts by some people in the federal government to make this a crime under the 14th Amendment. And so there'd be attempts at anti-lynching bills in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, etc. But what was the thing in the Senate? Where it takes only a minority to stop any law, a filibuster. There has finally been an anti-lynching bill passed. Does anybody know the president who signed it? Joe Biden. So, with that, what you come out of this is a philosophy by the 1890s called the lost cause. To make the Southerners seceding and starting the war. Everybody knew secession meant war. They're starting the war. They knew it then. They turned it into a noble fight. It wasn't about slavery. No. It wasn't slavery. We're fighting for our rights. It was states' rights. And the Northerners were trying to oppose, you hear it sometimes, the economic system. I heard one lost cause historian talking about Northerners attacked the South to have a tariff. What? So it was Northern aggression, states' rights, and so it justified the war. Now, during the Civil War, everybody called it one of two things. It was the Civil War or the War of the Rebellion. Those were the two names they gave it. But by the 1890s, they started saying the war between the states, no longer implying that this was a civil war where they betrayed their country, the United States. It was just a conflict between states, and therefore more justified. And it would become so used that a lot of people believe that was the actual name of it. And so a couple things about this. First off, this song, it's actually kind of a catchy tune. By the 1890s, would become a very popular song in the South. This is from the sheet music of I'm a Good Old Rebel. And here is the unveiling of a Confederate War Memorial in Virginia in 1898. And you'll notice the Confederate battle flag. The Confederate battle flag became the symbol of the lost cause. For example, here is a rally for the Confederate battle flag because it used to hang in front of the capital of South Carolina until 3 years ago. Every day they put up the Confederate battle flag as a symbol of the lost cause. That's part of the reason why the Confederate battle flag was so controversial. It wasn't so much so controversial after the war. Yes, it was the battle flag for the Confederacy, and it's a recognizable flag. It was for its symbolism of lost cause and pro-Jim Crow. That's why it's so controversial. And so, states' rights became equal to the lost cause, became equal to pro-Jim Crow. And so these are protesters for, this is actually 1970, Atlanta. It's about, they're actually protesting, they're making this massive Confederate monument, Stone Mountain it's called in Georgia. So they're protesting that and counter-protesters waving Confederate flags. This is Alabama, 1965. And this is the second of the Selma and Montgomery marches for voting rights, which would help lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and protesters with Confederate battle flags. The Confederate battle flag became the symbol of lost cause and segregation. So people have that flag. Whether they know it or not, they are symbolizing something. And many times they want people to believe this. So, also with this, history be revised. And this is the one that so gets me because I believe I told you about my history professor, the one traveling one at Rocky when I was a freshman, telling the class that slavery was all right. Slaves were treated really well. My guess is he could have very well had this textbook. This was a very popular textbook from the 1960s and 70s for junior high age. And it was how Negroes lived under slavery. And it said slave laws were not strictly enforced. And they said, our laws were not fully enforced. Many Negroes were taught to read and write. Many of them were allowed to meet in groups for preaching at funerals and singing and dancing. They visited at night and sometimes owned guns and other weapons. But my favorite part is, and I hope you agree, this is supposed to be a slave ship. Yeah, it's like they're riding like they're immigrants just taking the little trip over to come to the United States as farmers. So here's a book showing the effects of immigration. This is from a textbook. Now this one is junior high too, and it's showing immigration in the United States. And it says the Atlantic slave trade between 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Just a few workers were coming over. Not a big deal. Do you want to know when this book was published? Any guesses? 2021. Texas. But probably Florida too. And who knows? Yeah, they're touchy about slavery. They don't want to admit. And so that is why this scene disturbed me so much. This is from the January 6th insurrection. And these are people who want to overturn the election. They have Confederate flags, there's Trump flags, and various things, whatever. Now I'm talking about the merits of that. I mean, they were trying to overturn an election. But they're hanging this Confederate flag and they're on a statue. Anybody know what the statue this is? It's right in front of the United States Capitol, you know. A specific Civil War vets. Ulysses S. Grant. It's the Grant statue right in front of the Capitol. Right in front of the Capitol is Grant. Very fitting. And they're waving the Confederate flag. Now, there were a bunch of people running through the Capitol waving the Confederate flags, and there are people saying, oh, how dare someone bring the Confederate flag to the U.S. Capitol? Southern Democrats brought Confederate flags all the time. And then by the 1990s, it's going to be Southern Republicans. So that was actually not unusual. They just had it in their office. So this came to the Reconstruction myth. Fits in very well. It fits in with the lost cause. So the Reconstruction myth was this, that Reconstruction was actually a Northern invasion. In fact, that's the whole reason they did the war. The North attacked the South so they could have Reconstruction and lead to Black misrule to punish and destroy the South, to bring them under the Northern boot heel. Boot to their neck. So it was never about establishing rights. It was always to destroy the South, to destroy Southern whites, AKA at this time Southern Democrats. And this would really get a boost. In fact, it's hard to begin to tell you the impact of this movie, The Birth of a Nation. 1913, D.W. Griffith, and you can see right here, he basically invented movies. Before 1913, motion pictures would be these little vignettes. He created a full-length motion picture with a script that ran through the movie and tied different elements of the movie together, cut it in such a way to go through multiple scenes. It was never done like this. Modern movie making was made by this genius, D.W. Griffith. What is the movie about? Reconstruction. And the villains are Northern soldiers and freedmen. And who are the heroes? Well, let me give you a guess who the heroes are. The Birth of a Nation was based upon a book called The Klansman. The hero was the Ku Klux Klan. And it implied, after the defeat by the South in the Civil War, they rose up and were victorious in Reconstruction, reestablishing white rule. This is a scene of a carpetbagger, but they put him in blackface. These are both white actors in blackface. That's not an African American, that's a white actor in blackface. And the Klan saved the day. Here they are running out the carpetbaggers. The only consolation I get, since I'm going to be honest with you, I'm biased, I don't like the Klan. Does it look like the Klan are wearing plungers on their head? Now that image kind of comforts me. The plunger heads attacked. And this movie was so popular. I haven't done it for a few years. I've shown on special topics. It's hard for us to watch silent movies. We're just not used to it. We're just not used to the style that you have to overact because it's silent. And it just seems weird to us. If you get your mind into it, silent movies are really good. Silent horror movies are much more terrifying, to me at least, than ones with sound. Because your imagination has to do everything. Your imagination can be much more frightening than what you see. That's a really weird way of putting it. But, I thought I'd type that in. Two things. First off, President Wilson, it's going to be said to this day that President Wilson actually endorsed this movie. He was the first Democrat, or only the second Democrat elected since the Civil War. He was the president of Princeton College in New Jersey, but he was actually a Virginian. And he did not endorse this movie. But he wrote a history of the United States, and in it, he talked about Reconstruction being black misrule. He would be the president who would establish segregation in Washington, D.C. He's a complex character, President Wilson. But back to this. They took a bit from his book and put it as one of the slides, or they put this with the dialogue or description in between the talkies, and it might be hard to read, but it says, the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country. Does anybody want to guess what sprung up after this movie in 1913? This is what you have to add. The Klan reemerged. All over, but especially outside the South. The Klan was not very big in the South. Where was it big? The Plains. It was big in the Midwest, here. The northern Midwest, the Plains, and it was big in the West. So when I was in Miles City over Thanksgiving, I went with my mom and dad to the art. They have a really nice art museum in Miles City. And they had a big old pictures, which I love, the old pictures from Miles City. Back to when it was still Milestown, just starting all the way through. And there was a march of the Klan in Miles City in 1915. It was one of those, and they didn't acknowledge it was the Klan in the picture. I said, what's the Klan? And it's just a weird thing. The Klan, for example, by the 1920s, took over the state of Indiana. They were huge in parts of California and Oregon. And yes, they were big in Montana. Why? To keep people they didn't like out. Blacks, Jews, Catholics were their main targets. And it's no coincidence. Jim Crow and then Birth of a Nation led to a whole bunch of Confederate monuments all over. And these were symbols of the lost cause. These weren't memorials to those who died. Oh, sure, they might have said it, but they were memorials to the lost cause. And they were specifically designed also to enforce Jim Crow. Along Lee Circle and in Richmond, Virginia, there are a whole line of statues, which most of them have now been removed, but a whole line of statues of the Confederate war heroes right along the segregated edge of the white and black communities. So anybody on the black side of town had to cross over through a bunch of Confederate statues of Confederate war heroes to the other sections where most of the commercial activity was. It was a nice little reminder. So that's Lee Circle. There's a statue of Lee in Charlottesburg. This is the unveiling of the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue in Kentucky. Here is the unveiling of the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Yes, some Klan members there. Forrest appropriately oversees the Klan meeting. They just took this out of Tennessee, just barely past the Tennessee legislature, but last year. And you can see the big rise in Confederate monuments. That's why these are so controversial. They weren't memorials to the dead per se. They were about the lost cause. There'd be one more burst of Confederate monuments in the 60s, and that would be anti-civil rights. Anti-civil rights. And so those were the big monuments, including right after Birth of a Nation, there's just one little quaint town somebody might have visited, and they put this monument up. The Daughters of the Confederacy. Where's that? That's Women's Park. Okay, 4.5 years ago, the city council voted to take it down, and now it's a big hole. But that gives you an idea of just how big the Birth of a Nation was. And so from that, and then my favorite Confederate monument, this was a private monument right along the interstate in Nashville, Tennessee, was this crazy, ugly, insane Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I would argue that's a great poster because it makes them look horrible and keep it up. But the owner took that down and moved it to a more private location because they were constantly dumping red paint on it, protesters.
No way.
Huh?
Really?
Yeah.
No way.
So, the Gone with the Wind then, that book would be written because of Birth of the Nation. And this one laid out that all the gallantry and chivalry of the southern plantations. The heroes were the plantation owners. The slaves loved slavery. 1938, best picture of the year, and it was in color. Pretty amazing thing. The villains were Union soldiers. Here's from with a scroll beginning before the movie. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knight and their ladies fair, of master and slave. The knights were the slave owners, or slave owners. This was Best Picture. It's a good movie. If you have 4 hours to spare. It was a book in the movie, yeah. 38. There's another movie that was a bigger production, as Gone with the Wind, another colorized movie, but it was a kind of a flop, and no one talked about it. What movie was that? Wizard of Oz, yeah. And last thing for today, really quickly, there's a concept called sundown towns, and migrants from the South, especially black former sharecroppers who got out, they really couldn't go any place in the North. There were over 10,000 small to medium-sized towns, mostly in the North, the Plains, Montana, that were sundown towns. And basically what it meant was, with the term sundown, they would have signs like this: whites only after dark. No blacks, no American Indians, nobody of Hispanic descent out in this town when it's sundown. There were a bunch in Montana. And so black immigrants or black migrants moving north had to live in big cities. That's the only place they could live. Big cities. And the legacy is still there. Trust me, if you go to these small towns. My dad grew up in a little town. So my dad was born on the sharecroppers farm in 1943. They moved to this little town called Louisville, Nebraska. It's a little tiny town south of Omaha, about 1,000 people. And there was a sign outside of the main entrance into town, and it said, when he was a little kid, he remembers this, it said, "No N-word in town after dark." One time there were some railroad workers in town, and there were some, they were staying in town and going to the bars. This is during World War II, this is 1944. And there was a massive fight, and one of those workers, a young black man, was lynched. And they lynched him by sawing him in half on a barbed wire fence. That was the town my dad grew up in. It was horrible. All right, what are we doing tomorrow? Dress up, other stuff. All right, we'll see you. Have a good day.
I was last time.